The moment my husband leaned toward me at the White House ceremony and whispered, "Don't embarrass me," I knew he still had no idea who I really was. He looked at me like I was someone he needed to hide, like I didn't belong in that room. But then the four-star Admiral standing across the hall saw my invitation, walked straight toward me, and stopped the entire conversation with one sentence. "Colonel, we've been waiting for you." My husband's smile disappeared instantly. And in that moment, everyone finally learned the truth he spent years trying to ignore. My name is Claire Anderson. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I learned one important lesson. True strength does not need to announce itself. I was never the loudest person in the room. I wasn't someone who walked around expecting attention or praise. I believed that your actions spoke louder than anything you could say about yourself. That mindset shaped every part of my life, especially my military career. I joined the military when I was young because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. I wanted to be part of something built on discipline, responsibility, and trust. Over the years, I worked hard, earned every opportunity, and slowly climbed through the ranks. Becoming a colonel was never about the title for me. It was about the years behind it. The early mornings, the difficult decisions, the moments when I had to stay calm while everyone else was under pressure. The sacrifices that most people never saw. But outside of work, I was just Claire. A woman who enjoyed quiet dinners, weekend walks, and spending time with the people I loved. That was how I met Michael. When we first started dating, he was fascinated by my confidence. He told me he admired the way I handled challenges and how I never seemed afraid of difficult situations. He used to say that my determination was one of the reasons he fell in love with me. And for a while, I believed I had found someone who truly saw me. But after we got married, something slowly changed. Michael became more focused on appearances. He cared about how people viewed him, what others thought about his success, and how our life looked from the outside. At first, I ignored the small comments, the jokes about me being too serious. The way he changed the subject whenever someone asked about my career. The way he introduced me simply as his wife instead of mentioning the years I had spent serving. I never corrected him. I never demanded recognition, because I thought the person beside me didn't need the world to know my achievements. I thought he already knew, but I didn't realize that the man I loved had become uncomfortable with the very thing that made me who I was. And everything changed the day a white envelope arrived at our home. I still remember the exact moment I saw the envelope sitting on our kitchen counter. It wasn't a normal piece of mail. The official seal immediately caught my attention, and for a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it. I knew what it meant before I even opened it. It was an invitation to a special ceremony at the White House honoring military leaders and individuals who had made significant contributions through their service. I had received recognition before, but this felt different. Not because of the location. Not because of the attention, but because it represented years of work that most people never saw. Every difficult assignment, every sacrifice, every moment I chose duty over comfort. I opened the envelope quietly and read the details again. I was invited as Colonel Claire Anderson. Not just Claire. Not just someone's wife. Colonel Anderson. I smiled because, for once, I felt like a part of my life that I had quietly carried for years was finally being acknowledged. When Michael came home that evening, I couldn't help but share the news. "I got invited to a ceremony at the White House," I said. I expected him to be proud. I expected excitement. Instead, he paused. "Really?" he asked. There was something strange about the way he said it. Not happiness. Not surprise. Something closer to discomfort. He asked several questions. Who would be there? Would there be media? Would I have to speak? I answered him calmly, but inside, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. He wasn't excited about the opportunity. He was worried about the attention. Over the next few days, his attitude became clearer. He reminded me to keep things simple. He told me not to make a big deal out of my accomplishments. He said some people at events like that cared more about status than anything else. But deep down, I knew those words weren't really about the event. They were about him. For years, Michael had enjoyed being known as successful, but he had never really talked about my success. He liked telling people I was hardworking, but he rarely explained why. He knew about my career. He knew about my rank. He knew the sacrifices I had made. He simply acted like they weren't important. And I had accepted that because I loved him. I thought love meant not needing recognition from the person closest to you. I was wrong. The night before the ceremony, as I prepared my uniform, Michael stood in the doorway watching me. Then he said something that would stay with me forever. "Claire, tomorrow, please don't embarrass me." The morning of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. I remember standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my uniform carefully and making sure every detail was perfect. Not because I wanted attention, but because I respected what that uniform represented. It represented years of commitment, years of showing up when things were difficult, years of making decisions that affected people who depended on me. But as I looked at my reflection, I didn't feel nervous about the ceremony. I felt nervous about the person standing beside me, Michael. On the drive to Washington, he was unusually quiet. Normally, he would fill the silence with stories or talk about people he wanted to impress. But that day, he kept checking his phone and adjusting his suit. It was almost like he was preparing for an important event where I was just supposed to be there. When we arrived at the White House, I felt the atmosphere immediately. There were military officers, government officials, and guests from different backgrounds walking through the entrance. Everyone seemed to carry themselves with confidence, but there was also a sense of respect in the room. This wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring service. I walked beside Michael, quietly taking everything in. Then, as we approached the check-in area, he leaned closer to me. His voice was low enough that nobody else could hear. "Claire," he whispered, "please don't embarrass me today." For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. Embarrass him? I looked at him, waiting for some kind of explanation. But his expression was serious. He wasn't joking. He wasn't teasing. He genuinely believed I was someone he needed to control. I wanted to ask him what exactly he was afraid of. Was he worried I would speak too much? Was he worried people would ask questions? Or was he worried they would finally see the part of me he had spent years ignoring? I didn't answer. I simply smiled politely and continued walking. But inside, something shifted. For years, I had stayed quiet. I had allowed him to introduce me however he wanted. I had ignored the moments when he minimized my achievements. I had convinced myself that recognition didn't matter. But standing there in that room, wearing the uniform I had earned, I realized something. This wasn't about pride. It was about respect. And maybe Michael wasn't afraid I would embarrass him. Maybe he was afraid I would remind everyone who I really was. A few minutes later, we reached the check-in desk. And that was when everything changed. I handed my invitation to the hostess at the check-in desk, trying to ignore the nervous feeling building inside me. She smiled professionally and scanned the QR code on the invitation. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then her expression changed. It was subtle at first. Her eyes moved from the screen to my face, then back to the invitation again. She looked almost surprised. "Colonel Anderson?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." She straightened slightly and looked at the information again. "Please give me just a moment." I noticed Michael shifting beside me. He gave a small laugh, almost as if he wanted to make the situation less important. "She's probably just checking something," he said. But the hostess wasn't confused. She was recognizing something. Before I could say anything else, a voice behind us caught my attention. "Colonel Anderson?" I turned around. Standing a few feet away was a 4-star Admiral. The room around us suddenly felt quieter. People who had been talking nearby started looking in our direction. The Admiral walked toward me with a smile and extended his hand. "Colonel, it's an honor to finally meet you." For a moment, I was speechless. Not because I didn't know who I was, but because I could feel the entire energy of the room changing. The hostess immediately stepped aside. Michael stopped moving. The confident expression he had been wearing all morning disappeared. The Admiral continued speaking. He mentioned my previous assignments, my leadership, and the work my team had accomplished during some of the most challenging moments of my career. He didn't talk about my title like it was just a label. He talked about the responsibility behind it, the dedication behind it, the people who depended on me. And as I listened, I realized something. This was the first time in a long time that someone had spoken about my achievements without making them smaller. Michael stood silently next to me. The same man who had whispered, "Don't embarrass me," was now watching people treat me with respect. I looked around the room and saw something I had forgotten. I didn't need to prove myself. I didn't need permission to be proud of what I had accomplished. The woman standing there was not someone who needed to be hidden. She was Colonel Claire Anderson, and everyone in that room knew it, except, apparently, the man who had married me. The rest of the ceremony passed differently than I expected. For the first time that day, I stopped worrying about whether I was making someone else uncomfortable. I listened to the speeches. I spoke with other officers. I accepted congratulations from people who understood exactly what that uniform represented. And for those few hours, I felt like myself again. But the moment we stepped outside the building, I could feel the tension between Michael and me. He waited until we were away from the crowd before he finally spoke. "So, you just let everyone find out?" I looked at him, confused. "Find out what?" He sighed. "That you're a colonel. That you have all these accomplishments. You never thought to tell people?" I stared at him because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Michael, you knew." He looked away. "I knew you were in the military. I didn't know you were going to make such a big deal out of it." That sentence hurt more than I expected, because suddenly I understood. He wasn't surprised by my rank. He was surprised that other people cared about it. I reminded him of all the conversations we had over the years. The promotions, the awards, the leadership responsibilities, the difficult assignments. He had been there for all of it. He wasn't unaware. He just chose not to see it. And that realization changed the way I looked at our entire marriage. I thought about all the times someone asked what I did, and Michael simply said, "She works in the military." I thought about the moments when people complimented my dedication, and he quickly changed the subject. I thought about the jokes he made about how serious I was or how I was always in work mode. For years, I believed he was just being casual. But maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was uncomfortable standing next to someone who had built something he couldn't control. I finally asked him a question. "Michael, were you embarrassed because I did something wrong? Or were you embarrassed because people finally saw who I really am?" He didn't answer. And that silence told me more than words ever could. Because the problem was never that my success was too much. The problem was that he had spent years trying to make it seem like it wasn't enough. That night, I realized something painful. I had never needed the world to celebrate me. I only needed my husband to be proud of me. And somehow, that was the one thing he struggled to do. For years, I had convinced myself that love meant understanding someone's weaknesses. I told myself Michael didn't mean to minimize me. I told myself he was just different. Maybe he wasn't comfortable talking about achievements. Maybe he didn't understand how important those moments were to me. But after that ceremony, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The problem wasn't that Michael didn't know who I was. The problem was that he knew exactly who I was and still chose to make me feel smaller. A few days after we returned home, we sat down and had the conversation we had avoided for years. There was no audience, no uniforms, no important people watching, just the two of us. I looked at him and said, "Michael, I never needed you to introduce me as Colonel Anderson everywhere we went. I never needed you to tell strangers about my accomplishments." He stayed quiet. "But I needed you to be proud of me when nobody else was watching." That was the part he struggled to hear. Because he wanted to believe the problem was attention. He wanted to believe I cared too much about recognition. But that was never true. I didn't need applause. I needed partnership. I had spent years supporting his goals, celebrating his achievements, and standing beside him whenever he needed me. But somewhere along the way, I became the person he wanted beside him only when my success was convenient. I told him something I should have said much earlier. I spent years making myself smaller, so you could feel bigger. And I'm done doing that. For the first time, I saw regret on his face. He apologized. He admitted that maybe he had taken my strength for granted. He admitted that he should have celebrated me instead of hiding parts of me from others. But apologies cannot erase years of feeling invisible. They can only become the beginning of change. After that conversation, I made a promise to myself. I would never again apologize for my dedication. I would never hide my achievements to protect someone else's confidence. And I would never allow anyone, even someone I loved, to make me feel like my success was something embarrassing. Because the truth was simple. The woman I had spent years trying to hide was the same woman I had worked my entire life to become. And finally, I was ready to stand proudly as her. Looking back now, I realized the ceremony was never really about the Admiral recognizing me. It was never about the title. It was never about proving that I was important. The moment that changed me happened when I finally stopped questioning whether I deserved to take up space. For years, I had quietly accepted being overlooked because I thought that was what love required. I thought being humble meant staying silent. I thought supporting someone meant making sure they never felt uncomfortable standing beside you. But I learned something that changed everything. The right person will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. Michael and I eventually had to make difficult decisions about our future. Some wounds cannot be repaired simply because someone finally recognizes they caused them. Trust takes time. Respect takes consistency. And love without respect can slowly become a place where one person disappears. No matter what happened next, I walked away from that experience knowing one thing. I was proud of myself, not because someone important recognized me, not because a room full of people finally saw my achievements, but because I finally saw them myself. My uniform was never just fabric. It carried every sacrifice, every challenge, and every moment I chose courage over comfort. I spent years protecting others, leading others, and believing in others. It was time I believed in myself too. That day, my husband thought he was warning me not to embarrass him, but he never realized the truth. I was never the person who should have been embarrassed. I was the person who had spent years shrinking to protect someone else's ego. And I was done. Because the people who truly love you will not hide your light. They will stand beside you, celebrate your journey, and remind you that your success is not something you need to apologize for. It is something you earned.